Emily had always dreamed of visiting London. Growing up, she would see pictures of the beautiful Buckingham Palace, and it always seemed like a place of magic and grandeur. The idea of being in the heart of the city, walking the same streets where history had been made, filled her with excitement. It was her first time in England, and she couldn't wait to explore every corner of it. After spending her morning at the Tower of London, she made her way to the most iconic sight of all, Buckingham Palace. The weather was perfect for sightseeing. The sun was out, the sky was clear, and London was bustling with tourists from all around the world. Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of awe as she approached the palace. The guards, dressed in their distinctive red uniforms, stood like statues in front of the grand entrance, their towering black hats barely moving in the breeze. She'd seen them countless times on television, but now, standing in front of them in person, the moment felt surreal. As Emily joined the crowd gathered outside the gates, she felt a rush of excitement. It was more than just the beauty of the palace. It was the thought that she was standing in the very place where history had been made, where monarchs had lived for centuries. She took a deep breath, trying to take it all in. Tourists all around her were snapping pictures, some of them dressed in the colors of their national flags, while others stood quietly in awe, much like Emily. She had heard about the changing of the guard, the famous ceremony where the old guards are replaced by new ones. It was a grand spectacle, full of precision, discipline, and a strong sense of tradition. Emily had read that it was one of the highlights of any trip to London, and she was eager to see it for herself. As the time drew near, the crowd grew and the excitement became palpable. The sound of marching feet could be heard in the distance, and soon the new guards appeared, marching with sharp, synchronized steps toward the gates of the palace. Emily watched, wide-eyed, as the changing of the guard began. The soldiers moved with such precision, each step in perfect harmony with the others. She could hear the clinking of their boots against the pavement, and she was amazed by the attention to detail in their movements. The ceremony felt almost like a performance, and Emily couldn't help but be captivated by the sheer discipline on display. It was unlike anything she had ever seen before. When the ceremony concluded, the guards took their positions once again, standing like statues in front of the palace. Emily noticed that many people around her were rushing to get closer for photos, eager to snap a picture with the iconic guards. She was no different. She pushed through the crowd, trying to find the best angle for her camera. There were so many people that it was hard to get close, but Emily didn't mind. She was determined to get the perfect shot to show her friends back home. As she inched closer to one of the guards, Emily's excitement grew. She knew that the guards weren't allowed to speak or move, but she thought it would be fun to try to get a reaction from one of them. She wasn't expecting anything dramatic, of course, just a little smile, maybe a glance in her direction, or at the very least a subtle acknowledgement of her presence. After all, it was all in good fun, right? With her camera ready, Emily slowly approached one of the guards, her eyes fixed on the tall soldier who stood perfectly still in his red tunic and black hat. His face was expressionless, as she expected. She took a few quick photos, trying to capture the guard in his most stoic pose. Emily chuckled to herself, admiring how serious he looked. She couldn't help but feel a sense of amusement, thinking that this whole scene was a bit like a performance put on for the tourists. But Emily's curiosity got the best of her. She took another step forward, bringing her camera even closer to the guard's face. She was just a few inches away now, and she raised her camera to snap another picture. At the last moment, as if on instinct, she nudged the guard lightly with her shoulder. It was a small gesture, nothing too hard, nothing too bold, but enough to break the strict barrier of distance that the guards maintained. Immediately, the atmosphere changed. The guard didn't move, but Emily noticed the tension in the air. The smile on her face faded as she realized that she might have done something wrong. She quickly took a few more pictures, hoping that it was all part of the experience. However, the guard did not react. He didn't flinch, didn't give her a smile or even a look. He simply stood there, unmoving. Emily, feeling a bit awkward now, took a step back, still holding her camera. The crowd around her seemed to sense the shift in the mood as well. Some people continued to take pictures, while others seemed to be watching intently, as if waiting for something to happen. Emily, unsure of what to do next, thought that maybe the guard hadn't noticed her little nudge. After all, he was a professional soldier, trained to remain still, right? It wasn't like she had done anything too serious. But then something unexpected happened. The guard's eyes, which had been staring straight ahead, suddenly moved. They didn't shift to look at her in any way, but there was a noticeable change in the way he carried himself. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she realized that she had crossed an invisible line. The guard's stance, which had once been neutral, now seemed more rigid. The air grew heavier, as if the space around her had tightened, and she could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Before she could process what was happening, one of the palace security officers approached her quickly. He was calm but firm, his expression unreadable. Emily froze, her camera still in her hands. She hadn't done anything violent. But the shift in the guard's demeanor had caught the attention of the authorities. The officer didn't speak immediately but motioned for Emily to step back. "Excuse me, miss," the officer said, his voice low but authoritative. "Please move away from the guard." Emily's face flushed with embarrassment. She didn't know what to say. She had only nudged him lightly, and it seemed like such a small thing. But the way the officer was looking at her made it clear that she had done something wrong. Her mind raced, trying to understand what had just happened. She wasn't trying to disrespect the guard, but it was clear that her actions had been seen in a different light. The atmosphere had shifted so suddenly, and Emily felt like she had unwittingly stepped into a situation much more serious than she had ever imagined. The officer's eyes remained fixed on her, and for a brief moment she thought about trying to explain herself, but the look on his face told her that there was no need for words. This was about protocol, tradition, and the seriousness of the role that the King's Guard played in protecting the palace. Emily could see now that this wasn't just a tourist attraction. It was a sacred duty, and even a small disruption could not be taken lightly. She stepped back, the camera now hanging loosely in her hands. The officer turned away, but Emily could still feel the eyes of the crowd on her, the weight of the moment sinking in. She had just learned a valuable lesson, but the question remained, would the consequences of her actions be as minor as she hoped, or would they be something much more unexpected? Emily took a deep breath as the security officer stepped away, leaving her with the strange feeling that she had just crossed some kind of invisible line. She had no idea what was going to happen next, but she could tell from the way the officer looked at her that this was more serious than she had originally thought. She stood there for a moment, still in shock, trying to process what had just occurred. Her excitement about being in London quickly faded as the reality of the situation began to sink in. At first, Emily thought it was all just a misunderstanding, something that would blow over as soon as she explained herself. She had only nudged the guard lightly. It wasn't like she had done anything wrong on purpose. However, she quickly realized that there were deeper layers to this situation, layers she hadn't even considered. It wasn't just about one small act of playful curiosity. It was about tradition, respect, and the responsibilities that came with being in such a sacred place. The King's Guard wasn't just a ceremonial feature of the palace. They represented something far greater. The King's Guard had been part of British history for centuries. Their primary duty was to protect the monarch and the royal family, a responsibility that was taken very seriously. It wasn't just a job, it was a calling, a symbol of British strength, honor, and tradition. These guards were highly trained soldiers, not just statues in uniforms. Their discipline was unmatched, and every action they took, from the way they stood to the way they marched, was part of a centuries-old tradition. Emily had heard of the King's Guard before, of course. She knew they were famous for their stoic expressions and their ability to stand perfectly still for hours at a time. Tourists loved to take pictures with them, often getting too close or making lighthearted attempts to get a reaction from them. But what Emily didn't fully understand was how serious the guard's role was, or how strict the protocols surrounding their behavior were. To the outside world, it might look like a fun and quirky photo op, but to the soldiers themselves, it was a matter of great importance. Every movement, every glance, and every gesture was carefully controlled, not because they wanted to seem distant or unapproachable, but because they were there to uphold something far more significant than a tourist's entertainment. As Emily thought about it more, she realized that she had unknowingly disrespected this tradition. The King's Guard weren't there to entertain her or anyone else. They were there for a purpose, and that purpose was to protect the monarchy, the country, and its history. The fact that she had pushed the guard even lightly was more than just a breach of personal space. It was a violation of the protocols that had been in place for centuries. The guards were not to be treated like statues or objects for amusement. They were soldiers who had earned their place at Buckingham Palace, and their role in British society demanded respect. Emily could hear the whispers of tourists around her as they continued to take photos, many of them unaware of the tension that had just unfolded. A few of them were still laughing and joking, thinking it was all part of the experience. But Emily could sense that something had changed. The guard's stiffened posture, the officer's stern look, and the crowd's sudden silence all pointed to the gravity of the situation. She had crossed a line, and the seriousness of that line was only now becoming clear to her. A group of tourists gathered around, some still excited to take their photos, while others seemed to be watching Emily with a mix of curiosity and judgment. She felt uncomfortable now, like the center of attention for all the wrong reasons. Some of the tourists were still smiling and joking, but Emily's sense of unease grew as she realized that her actions had caused a ripple effect. She wasn't just standing in front of a guard anymore. She was at the center of a cultural misunderstanding, and she had no idea how to navigate it. The officer who had spoken to her earlier now stood at a distance, observing the situation. Emily noticed him scanning the crowd, looking for anyone who might be causing trouble or breaking the rules. His eyes briefly met hers, and for a split second, she could see the seriousness in his expression. She had thought that this was just a minor mistake, but she now understood that her actions had put the guards, the security staff, and even the tourists in a difficult position. She had tested the boundaries of the unspoken rules, and now there was a consequence to face. As the minutes ticked by, Emily felt like she was in a kind of limbo. The excitement she had felt just moments earlier was gone, replaced by a growing anxiety. She had never intended to cause any trouble, but now she was unsure what to do. Should she apologize? Should she try to explain that it was just a playful gesture? Or would that only make the situation worse? She glanced over at the guard again, who remained perfectly still, his eyes still fixed ahead. Despite the tension that hung in the air, he didn't flinch or react in any way. He was trained to remain motionless, to stay silent, and to keep his composure no matter what. It was as if he was part of the very architecture of Buckingham Palace itself, an immovable symbol of British tradition. Emily wondered what it must be like to have that kind of discipline, to be able to stand still for hours without showing even the smallest sign of emotion. As she watched the guard, Emily's thoughts turned to the strict protocols that governed his every movement. She realized that the guards weren't just standing there for show. They were part of a long-standing tradition that had deep roots in British history. They weren't just soldiers. They were symbols of something much bigger than themselves. They represented the monarchy, the country, and the ideals of duty and service that had been passed down through generations. The moment she had nudged the guard, she had unknowingly disrupted that tradition. Emily's embarrassment deepened as she thought about how much she had taken for granted. She had come to Buckingham Palace expecting a light-hearted experience, a fun moment to capture in a photo. But now she saw that this place and the people who stood guard there represented something much more serious. The King's Guard wasn't a novelty to be poked and prodded for entertainment. They were there to protect, to serve, and to honor the legacy of the monarchy. It was a humbling realization for Emily. She had come to London with excitement and wonder, eager to see the sights and experience the history. But in her excitement, she had overlooked the importance of the very thing she had come to see. The King's Guard, stoic and silent as they were the living embodiment of a centuries-old tradition that demanded respect. Emily hadn't just made a mistake. She had inadvertently disrespected something that meant a great deal to the people of the United Kingdom. As she continued to stand there, trying to process everything that had happened, Emily felt a growing sense of guilt. She had acted thoughtlessly, without fully understanding the gravity of the situation. She had nudged a guard for fun, but in doing so, she had disrupted a moment of tradition and discipline that was far bigger than her. She could only hope that her actions hadn't caused too much trouble, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized that the consequences of her actions might be more than just a simple reprimand. She had learned a valuable lesson about the importance of respecting tradition and understanding the deeper meanings behind the places and people she encountered, and it was a lesson that would stay with her long after her trip was over. The moment the security officer stepped toward Emily, she knew the situation had taken a serious turn. She had been trying to make light of it all, thinking it was a harmless gesture, a little nudge to get the perfect shot. But now she could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, and the growing tension in the air told her that something had gone wrong. The officer, though calm, had a certain air of authority that left no room for questioning. His expression was neutral, but there was no mistaking the seriousness in his demeanor. Emily's heart started to race as he approached. She had no idea what was going to happen next. She hadn't expected any consequences from her action, but now the reality of the situation was sinking in. She had crossed a boundary, and it was clear that she had done something that wasn't just a minor mistake. The officer stopped in front of her, his eyes scanning her face with a look of quiet professionalism. "Excuse me, miss," the officer said, his voice calm but firm. "Please step back from the guard." The words hit Emily like a wave. Her brain tried to process what was happening, but everything felt like it was happening in slow motion. She had seen the changing of the guard 1,000 times in videos and photos, but she hadn't realized how serious everything surrounding it was. Now, standing in front of a real officer, she felt the full weight of her mistake. She had not just gotten too close to the guard. She had disrupted something much more significant, something that demanded respect and discipline. Emily tried to gather her thoughts, but her hands were shaking slightly. She had not meant any harm. She had simply been caught up in the excitement of the moment, wanting to get a picture of the iconic guard. She had read about the rules, but the excitement of being in such an important place had clouded her judgment. She had only meant to get a little closer, to snap the perfect photo, but in her eagerness, she had pushed the boundaries of what was acceptable. As the officer guided her away from the guard, Emily noticed the change in the crowd's energy. The casual chatter and laughter that had filled the air just moments before had quieted down. Tourists were still snapping pictures, but there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Some were looking at Emily with curiosity, while others seemed to have caught on to the tension surrounding her. Emily felt the weight of their gazes on her, and it made her uncomfortable. As she stepped away from the scene, the officer's presence beside her felt like a reminder of just how serious the situation had become. Emily hadn't thought much of her actions at first, but now, with the officer standing beside her and the guard still standing at attention in the background, she realized that what she had done was more than just an innocent mistake. It was a breach of something much bigger than herself. The officer didn't say anything more at first, and Emily could hear the soft shuffle of footsteps from other tourists as they continued to take pictures, still unaware of what had just unfolded. She was too stunned to speak, but she felt a deep sense of regret. What had she done? How could something so small, something so insignificant to her, have caused such a shift in the atmosphere? The feeling of guilt and unease settled over her, and she couldn't help but wonder if she was going to face consequences beyond this brief encounter. "Just stay here for a moment," the officer said finally, his voice still calm but with an undertone of seriousness. "We need to make sure there's no disruption. You'll be asked to move along shortly." Emily nodded, her throat tight. She didn't know how long she stood there, but it felt like an eternity. Time seemed to stretch as she stood in the shadow of the guard, who remained still and unflinching, his eyes never leaving the horizon. Emily couldn't help but admire the guard's discipline, even as she realized that she had unintentionally tested it. She had been curious, yes, but she hadn't understood the depth of the responsibility that came with standing in such a revered place. A few minutes passed before another security officer appeared beside the first. Emily wasn't sure if he was there to speak to her or if he had simply been on patrol, but he looked at her briefly before turning his attention to the rest of the crowd. The two officers exchanged a few quiet words, and then the second officer turned to Emily. "Please follow me," he said. "You need to be moved to a separate area." Emily's stomach churned with nervousness. Her mind raced, wondering what was going to happen next. Would she be kicked out of the palace grounds? Would they call the police? She hadn't intended to make such a scene, but now the reality of her actions was setting in. This wasn't just a reprimand. It was starting to feel like something much more serious. As the officers led her away from the area where the guard stood, Emily couldn't help but look over her shoulder. The guard still stood perfectly still, his posture as rigid as ever. It felt strange to be walking away from the scene. Just moments ago, everything had seemed so normal, so full of excitement. But now the mood had shifted completely. She was no longer just a tourist in a famous location. She was part of a situation that had the attention of not just the officers, but the other tourists around her. They had seen the exchange, and now they were all watching her every move. Once they reached a quiet corner away from the crowd, the officer stopped and turned to face Emily. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest. The first officer, the one who had spoken to her initially, looked at her with a stern yet calm expression. "Do you understand why we had to ask you to step back?" he asked, his tone firm but not unkind. Emily nodded quickly, her throat still tight. "Yes," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't mean any disrespect. I just thought I could get closer for a photo. I didn't know it was that serious." The officer nodded. "It's not about the photo, miss. The King's Guard are not just there for photos or entertainment. They have a job to do and they must remain undisturbed. What you did, though small, disrupted that. We cannot allow that." Emily felt a wave of embarrassment wash over her. She had thought it was just a harmless mistake, but now she understood that her actions had interfered with something much more important than she had realized. She hadn't just crossed a physical line. She had crossed an unwritten code of respect that had been in place for hundreds of years. "I'm sorry," Emily said, her voice shaky now. "I really didn't mean to cause any trouble. I just got caught up in the moment." The officer's expression softened slightly, but he didn't let his guard down. "It's okay. We understand that tourists sometimes don't know all the rules, but this is a reminder to be mindful of where you are and the traditions you're engaging with. It's not just about taking pictures. It's about respecting the people and the culture here." Emily nodded again, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for his understanding, but also a sense of shame for what had happened. She hadn't meant any harm, but her actions had still disrupted the peace of the palace, and she would have to live with that. She realized that she had learned a valuable lesson that she would never forget. The officer turned to walk away, leaving Emily standing there for a moment, still trying to process everything that had happened. She had come to London expecting an adventure, a fun and light-hearted experience. Instead, she had learned the importance of respecting the traditions and responsibilities that came with being a guest in such an iconic place. It wasn't just about taking photos. It was about understanding the deeper significance of the places and people she encountered. And in that moment, Emily realized how important it was to approach every new experience with respect, humility, and a willingness to learn.